Danny Rolling, the Gainesville Ripper, the real-life nightmare that inspired Scream. What if one of Hollywood's most terrifying horror movies wasn't fiction? What if the monster lived among us? In the summer of 1990, Gainesville, Florida, an ordinary college town, was shattered by a nightmare so real, it haunted a nation forever. Under the sweltering Florida heat of August, the idyllic streets of Gainesville were stained with a chilling terror. A town once filled with hope and promise became paralyzed by fear and carnage. 5 students, young, vibrant, full of dreams, were brutally murdered in their homes. Their bodies were mutilated and posed in grotesque displays. It all happened in just 4 days. The killer left behind no fingerprints, no DNA, only fear and confusion that would forever change a community. But what kind of monster commits such acts and leaves an indelible mark on American true crime history? What drives someone to kill with such calculated brutality? By the time it was over, the name Danny Rolling, the Gainesville Ripper, would haunt America forever. The full story, the depths of his depravity, and the twisted legacy of his life would leave scars far beyond the grim crime scenes. Families clung to each other. College students slept in groups. The media descended like vultures, hungry for answers. But beneath the headlines, a deeper story unfolded. One of unimaginable terror, shattered innocence, and a community pushed to the brink. This is not just the tale of a serial killer. It is the story of the victims whose lives were stolen, the investigators who refused to give up, and the chilling psychological descent of a man who would become known as the Gainesville Ripper. In this episode, we peel back the curtain and plunge into the heart of one of America's most notorious murder sprees. What motivated Danny Rolling to unleash such evil? How did the victim's loved ones cope with the aftermath? And what secrets still haunt the streets of Gainesville to this day? As we retrace every step, every clue, and every heartbreak, ask yourself, how well do you really know the people around you? Could a killer be hiding in plain sight, even in the safest of places? Stay with us as we unravel the true story that inspired the movie Scream, and discover the chilling reality that fiction can never truly capture. In the humid, sun-drenched days of August 1990, Gainesville was a town transformed by hope and anticipation. Thousands of students arrived to begin a new chapter at the University of Florida, their dreams stretching as wide as the blue Florida sky. For the parents sending their children off to college, Gainesville promised safety, opportunity, and the everyday joys of campus life. But beneath this facade of normalcy, a shadow crept quietly, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Danny Harold Rolling, a name few had ever heard, was about to become infamous. Born on May 5, 1954, in Shreveport, Louisiana, Rolling grew up in a troubled home marked by instability and abuse. James Harold Rolling was a decorated police officer, but at home, his badge offered no protection. He ruled with intimidation and anger, often blurring the line between discipline and abuse. For Danny, the household was a place of fear. Some of his earliest memories were of his mother being struck, his brother, Kevin, punished harshly, and his dog dying in his arms. Long before he became a name the world would fear, Danny Rolling was a child quietly shaped by violence. His mother, Claudia, bore the weight of emotional abuse, doing what she could to shield her sons. But Danny internalized the chaos. He grew up quiet and withdrawn, masking pain with silence that hardened into anger. As he entered adulthood, that anger turned inward and outward. Petty crimes, drug use, a sense of disconnection became part of his routine as he drifted, lost in plain sight. Then came the breaking point. In a fit of rage, Danny shot his father and fled, vanishing into the underbelly of America. He moved through states using stolen identities, each one a mask, over the turmoil boiling beneath. In Kansas City, he found the name Michael Kennedy, lifted from the grave of a Vietnam veteran. At 36, Rolling, now posing as Michael, boarded a Greyhound bound for Gainesville, Florida, unraveling with every mile. He checked into a nearby motel, just blocks from the University of Florida, close enough to blend in, far enough to remain unnoticed. For 6 days, Rolling stayed there, watching, planning. On August 23rd, he walked into a local supermarket, bought camping gear, and stole tools: gloves, duct tape, a screwdriver. That afternoon, he disappeared into the dense woods off Archer Road, just steps from the University of Florida's student housing. There, hidden beneath the trees, he made camp. By night, he scouted the neighborhood. He broke into homes for food and supplies, learning the patterns of students who had no idea someone was out there, watching. Gainesville carried on, unaware that its peace was already shattered. The man in the woods wasn't just hiding, he was preparing, but within days, it would be bathed in fear. In the early morning hours of August 24th, 1990, the nightmare began. Danny Rolling, dressed in black clothing and a ski mask, armed with a Marine Corps K-bar knife, duct tape, and a screwdriver, crept into one of the Williamsburg Village apartments shared by 18-year-old Sonia Larson and 17-year-old Christina Powell. They were best friends. They had just moved in, excited to begin their freshman year at the University of Florida. He had been watching them, stalking them. He broke in through the back door. What he did next defied comprehension. Upon entering the apartment, Rolling observed Christina Powell asleep on the downstairs couch. He stood over her briefly, but did not awaken her. He then snuck upstairs, where he found Sonia Larson asleep in her bedroom. He taped her mouth shut to silence her screams, then stabbed her repeatedly in the chest. Christina remained asleep downstairs, unaware of the horror unfolding just above her. Rolling descended upon her next, binding her hands and mouth before assaulting her. When he was done, he stabbed her 5 times in the back. Before leaving, he posed their lifeless bodies in ritualistic staging, a signature of his depravity that even shook seasoned investigators to their core. He then casually took a shower in their apartment, before calmly walking away. But the nightmare didn't stop there. Within 48 hours, Rolling claimed 3 more lives. Krista Hoyt, Tracy Pauls, and Manuel Taboada, known as Manny. Each scene was more gruesome than the last. Each murder more ritualistic, more chilling. Rolling ambushed Krista Hoyt, an 18-year-old honors student, in her home. He violated her, stabbed her through the back, then decapitated her. He placed her head on a bookshelf to face her mutilated body in a grotesque final tableau. By now, fear had settled over Gainesville. Classes were canceled. Students moved in groups, armed with bats and pepper spray. Hardware stores quickly sold out of deadbolts. But with the killer still at large and no solid leads, terror spread like wildfire. Parents pulled their children out of school. Police scrambled for answers in the dark. The killing spree showed no end. 2 more victims, roommates Tracy Pauls and Manny Tabawada, both 23, were found in their apartment just 2 days later. Manny, a former football player, fought rolling fiercely. But his strength was no match for the blade of a Marine Corps-style K-bar knife. He was overpowered and stabbed 30 times to death. After killing Manny, Rolling turned his attention to Tracy. Hearing the struggle, she tried to barricade herself in her bedroom. Rolling broke through, just like his other victims. He bound her, sexually assaulted her, took her life in a brutal stabbing, then left her body carefully staged, as if performing one final grotesque act for an unseen audience. The brutality and ritualistic nature of the murders sent shockwaves through the community. The town had become a hunting ground for a predator hiding in plain sight. Gun stores sold out. Helicopters scanned the skies, while police worked around the clock. They were in over their heads, with no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no DNA. Investigators relied on profiling and circumstantial evidence. Gainesville was gripped by fear. Students fled campus. Families locked their doors, terrified that the killer could be anyone, anywhere. The Ripper's attacks were so calculated, so merciless, that some wondered if they were dealing with something more than human. His crimes were not random. His victims shared unsettling similarities. Petite, white, brunette women, eerily resembling his estranged mother. This pattern, combined with Rolling's gruesome staging of the bodies, suggested the work of a killer seeking both power and attention. Experts weighed in. Was it the work of a deranged psychopath, or the calculated acts of a sadistic mastermind? The media's coverage was relentless, amplifying fears and spreading rumors. They dubbed the killer the Gainesville Ripper, drawing parallels to the infamous Jack the Ripper. The town descended into chaos. But who was this monster, and why was he doing this? Yet, in the midst of chaos, there were moments of courage and heartbreak. Survivors shared their stories. Investigators pushed beyond exhaustion, and the victims' families faced the unimaginable with strength and dignity. The story of the Gainesville Ripper is not just one of evil. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the quest for justice in the face of unspeakable tragedy. The challenge facing Gainesville's law enforcement was unlike anything they had encountered before. The killer was a phantom, striking quickly, then vanishing without a trace. The brutality of the murders, marked by sexual assault, mutilation, and post-mortem posing, pointed to a perpetrator who craved control, dominion, and notoriety. The victims, all young and full of promise, appeared to have been chosen at random, a terrifying prospect that made everyone feel like a potential target. Police patrols increased, but the sense of vulnerability was overwhelming. Each new day brought fresh terror. Would the killer strike again? Would he ever be caught before more lives were lost? Investigators faced a daunting lack of physical evidence. The crime scenes were meticulously staged, with the killer leaving behind almost no trace, no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon. The savage nature of the attacks suggested a deep-seated rage, but also a chilling sense of dominance. The killer seemed to revel in taunting the police, daring them to stop him. With no solid leads, suspicion fell on the most unlikely suspects. Rumors spread like wildfire. Whispers of occult rituals, satanic cults, even possible links to other unsolved murders. The media frenzy only amplified the chaos, with every detail scrutinized and sensationalized for the victims' families. The wait for answers became unbearable, a daily torment with no end in sight. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, detectives worked tirelessly, building a psychological profile of the killer. They brought in experts in criminology and forensic psychology, searching desperately for patterns and motives. Was this the work of a lone madman, or was Gainesville facing the calculated terror of a serial killer on the loose? The stakes could not have been higher, and the community's faith in law enforcement hung by a thread. To understand the Gainesville Ripper, we must first delve into the mind of Danny Rolling, a man shaped by violence, rejection, and a desperate need for recognition. Rolling's early years were a crucible of pain. From birth, he was resented by his father, a man who told him from the moment he could understand that he was destined for prison or an early grave. His mother, Claudia, saw the danger clearly, but every time she tried to leave, something pulled her back into a cycle she couldn't escape. There was no love, no warmth. Birthdays and holidays were forbidden. The boys lived in fear. Fear that even the smallest infraction could trigger beatings or psychological torment. Danny bore the brunt. Whipped weekly, berated daily, punished for how he sat or breathed, and forbidden to cry. As he grew older, he witnessed his mother's abuse, but was too terrified to intervene. One Christmas, she ran with the kids, but, like always, she came back. The emotional toll drove her to a breakdown, and Danny's health and school performance began to crumble. Counseling was recommended, but never pursued. Instead, he was mocked by the very man responsible for his decline. In his early teens, consumed by despair, Danny tried to take his own life with a razor blade. But even then, freedom eluded him. School offered little refuge. Isolated and awkward, he struggled academically and socially. He retreated into elaborate fantasies, imagining himself powerful, respected. Everything he lacked in real life. As a teenager, those dreams began to curdle. He turned to voyeurism, petty theft, drugs, and alcohol. Not just as escapes, but as ways to exert control over a life that constantly seemed to slip through his fingers. These weren't just acts of teenage rebellion. They were warning signs, early tremors of a deeper psychological fracture, one that would eventually erupt into a tragedy that shook America. Danny Rolling dropped out of high school in his sophomore year. At 17, he joined the U.S. Air Force, only to be discharged 2 years later for drug abuse. A trail of arrests followed: burglary, theft, and increasingly serious crimes. By 1974, at just 20, he married Omather Lamas and had a daughter. But the marriage crumbled under the weight of domestic violence and instability. By 1978, O'Mather fled with their child, severing all ties. The separation pushed Rolling deeper into isolation. He drifted across the South, surviving through armed robberies, cycling in and out of prison. In 1979, a conviction for holding up a Georgia grocery store earned him 6 years behind bars. But prison didn't rehabilitate him. It hardened him. When released in 1988, he emerged angry, unstable, and untethered. Back in Shreveport, he moved in with his parents, unnerving neighbors with his erratic behavior. Serene one moment, threatening the next. Some called him Rambo, a nickname that masked the danger simmering beneath the surface. That danger finally erupted on May 19, 1990. A fight with his father over a broken car window ended with Rolling shooting him in the face. Though his father survived, he was left permanently blinded in one eye. Danny vanished into the southern back roads. But this wasn't just flight, it was transformation. Obsessed with serial killers like Ted Bundy, and consumed by fantasies of rape, murder, and mutilation. Rolling no longer sought redemption or connection. He was now a man on the run, armed and ready to fulfill the violent legacy he believed he was destined for. When Rolling arrived in Gainesville, he was a man on the edge, homeless, desperate, and driven by a compulsion he could no longer resist. The murders that followed were meticulously planned, each one a twisted expression of his need for dominance and fame. Gainesville remained in the grip of terror. Police sifted through thousands of tips, interrogated suspects, and worked with FBI profilers to narrow the search. Frustration mounted, and so did the community's fear. As summer turned to fall, the killer's identity remained a chilling enigma, hidden in plain sight. While Gainesville trembled, investigators chased leads, desperate for answers. Their first suspect, Edward Humphrey, a local student with a troubled past and erratic behavior. He was arrested and blasted across the media as the face of evil. But there was no physical evidence tying him to the crimes. In the midst of the chaos, Humphrey's facial scars and outbursts made him an easy target. He was held for months, but eventually, DNA evidence cleared him of any involvement. The journey to justice was far from over. The real killer remained at large, and the fear in Gainesville persisted. It wasn't until a series of events unfolded that law enforcement would finally uncover the truth behind the Gainesville Ripper. A tip from Shreveport, Louisiana, shifted the investigation's focus. Nearly a year before the Gainesville horror began, in November 1989, Julie Grissom, a bright 24-year-old college student, her father Tom, and her nephew Sean, were murdered in their home while preparing dinner. Julie's body had been mutilated, cleaned, and posed. Details that mirrored the staging and brutality of the Gainesville crime scenes. The connection went unnoticed at first, but when DNA from the Shreveport case revealed that the killer had type B blood, matching Danny Rolling, it was called a revelation. For the first time, two horrific murder sprees were undeniably linked. Shortly after, Cindy Jurasich, a former acquaintance of Rolling's, came forward. She recalled chilling conversations. Moments when Rolling spoke of sticking knives into people, watching women in Florida, and idolizing serial killers like Ted Bundy. He told her he wanted to become a superstar. Her tip led investigators to Rolling, already in custody for a supermarket robbery, committed just days after the Gainesville murders. A search of his campsite revealed the evidence: blood-stained tools and clothing, matching forensic samples from the crime scenes. But the most chilling discovery was a cassette tape, an audio diary, a confessional, where Rolling referred to himself as the Mystery Rider, spoke of a dark alter ego, and calmly detailed his fantasies of murder. DNA evidence sealed the case, but it was the tape, Rolling's own voice, narrating his crimes, that removed all doubt. He confessed to the Gainesville murders and the triple homicide in Shreveport, claiming he was driven by an alternate personality named Gemini, inspired by The Exorcist III. In February 1994, he stood before the court, unflinching, expressionless, and uttered 5 words that would seal his fate. "Yes, sir, I do." With that, one of Florida's darkest chapters came to a chilling close. The trial drew national attention. Courtroom spectators, including victims' families, wept as prosecutors laid out the horror: how Rolling had stalked his victims, broken into their homes with precision, and posed their bodies in ritualistic ways. The most haunting moment came when evidence from the Shreveport murders was introduced. DNA matched semen from the scene, and Rolling's handwritten confession was read aloud. The courtroom fell silent. This was no longer a regional tragedy. It was a national nightmare. In the penalty phase, the defense tried to humanize him. Witnesses recounted a childhood shaped by relentless abuse, where Rolling lived in fear of his violent, authoritarian father, a man he once tried to shoot. Psychologists testified that Rolling suffered from multiple personality disorders and paraphilic urges, but no diagnosis could outweigh the cruelty of his crimes. Without a single dissent, the jury delivered its verdict. Death was the only justice they could give. Rolling declined to speak at sentencing, submitting only a cryptic written statement full of biblical references and ramblings about demons. As victims' families addressed him through tears, he sat still. He sat still, smirking. The mask had finally dropped. Danny Rolling was sentenced to die. The case of the Gainesville Ripper is a haunting study in contrasts the innocence of youth, shattered by unimaginable violence, the resilience of a town tested by fear, and the unanswerable question: what compels someone to commit such atrocities? It is a story of lives stolen, families broken, and a community forced to confront its own vulnerability. The names Sonia Larson, Christina Powell, Krista Hoyt, Tracy Pauls, and Manuel Taboada are etched into Gainesville's memory. Solemn reminders of the price paid for one man's descent into darkness. Danny Rolling's legacy also seeped into pop culture. Screenwriter Kevin Williamson has said, "The idea for Scream struck him while watching a documentary about the Gainesville murders. The randomness, the terror, the raw fear. It struck a nerve. Though the film took creative liberties, its roots were tangled in Gainesville's grief. Scream became a franchise, a phenomenon, even a punchline at times. But for those who lived through the real nightmare, it was never fiction. For investigators, the path to justice was steeped in frustration and pain, but also marked by hard-won triumph. Driven by persistence and duty, they pieced together the clues to catch a killer who seemed to vanish into thin air. The case reshaped law enforcement. Gainesville police overhauled protocols. The FBI refined its profiling techniques. Today, the Rolling case is still studied in criminal justice classrooms. A blueprint of evil hiding in plain sight. And the slow but steady pursuit of justice. Yet, for survivors and the families left behind, the pain never truly fades. The murders sparked national conversations on campus safety, mental health, and the systemic cracks that let killers slip through. Colleges across the country ramped up security. Students grew cautious. But scars remain. A chilling reminder that horror doesn't need a reason. In Gainesville, a memorial garden honors the 5 slain students. Each fall, candlelight vigils illuminate their names. Under the Florida night sky, healing continues, but never finishes. Danny Rolling's story stretches beyond headlines and horror movies. His crimes forced America to look inward, at the unseen traumas, the ignored warning signs, and the societal blind spots that let monsters thrive. The lessons of Gainesville are as urgent today as they were in 1990. Stay vigilant. Lead with empathy, and remember that in the face of tragedy, communities can still rise. As we reflect on that harrowing summer, we're reminded that justice may be slow, but it endures. Yet the true test of a community isn't in how it falls, but in how it rises. As terrifying as Rolling's tale is, it reminds us evil doesn't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes it grows in plain view, nurtured by neglect, fueled by pain, and unnoticed until it's too late. Could another Gainesville Ripper already be out there, waiting for their moment? Have we learned enough to stop the next one? And when you turn out the lights tonight, remember, Danny Rolling was a drifter, a thief, someone overlooked, until he became one of America's most feared predators. What signs did we miss? What more could have been done? The answers remain elusive, but the questions echo on. Was he born a monster, or made by the hell he lived through? His story forces us to confront the darkness that can take root in ordinary homes, and the terrifyingly thin line between safety and chaos. And then comes the twist. Rolling claimed 8 victims, but only 7 were ever confirmed. Are there more souls lost to silence? Their stories still buried in shadow. We may never know the full extent of his crimes. Some retired detectives and psychologists believe Rolling carried more secrets to his grave. Across the southeastern USA, a chilling pattern lingers. Unsolved murders from the late 80s and early 90s, marked by body posing, calculated violence, and vanishing forensic traces. Were these the work of Danny Rolling, or someone he inspired? The truth may be lost to time. So long as the truth remains incomplete, the shadow he casts will never fully fade. If this story struck a chord, honor the victims by remembering their names and sharing their stories. Subscribe to Criminy Docs for more cases that don't just haunt, but reveal. Turn on notifications and never miss the next chilling chapter. Stay alert, stay curious, because the next story might already be unfolding just outside your door. So tonight, as you turn the key and check the locks, ask yourself, could another Gainesville Ripper already be among us? We'll keep digging into the minds of the world's most dangerous killers and amplifying the voices of those who survived. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. What else hides in the shadows? The truth is out there.